G'day and welcome to another video by the Eccentric Electrician. Today I'll be talking about flexi pens. Pens with flex, what a flex nib is, why it's used, those sorts of things. So, flex nib, what differentiates a flex nib from a standard nib? Alright, so I'll bring out a standard hard nib. One that's known for not having much give to it is the Platinum. So this is a Platinum 3776 pen with a 14K nib. These pens are not really known for flexing at all or even being springy. Now a flex pen is just the opposite. They're incredibly flexy and they tend to give you line variation. As can be seen here. So flex pens and flex nibs are generally used for calligraphy, doing fancier writing. Some people would like to use them for everyday writing, but they're generally used to flourish your work, make it look, give it you this line variation. There's a lot of debate on what a flex nib is and whether vintage is better than modern and all these sorts of things. So I'll only be giving my opinions today, and maybe a little bit of help for people that haven't been able to buy the pens and try things that they want to. And yes, I will mention a dip pen. I've got one here just for comparison, as they're generally considered the flexiest nibs you can get, apart from some of the vintage pens. Alright, so first, we'll start off on modern pens. Very common one nowadays is the Noodles Ahab or the Noodles Conrad. Both these ones have flex nibs. And the reason these are flex nibs is because they've got a slit that goes all the way up the pen. And when you actually press down, it opens that slit all the way up and gives you your line variation that way. I don't have the Conrad inked up, but it doesn't matter. Most of these pens today I'll be dipping and writing with, as opposed to actually filling the pens up, just because it's a bit easier that way. So the Ahab, this is probably one of the more common ones. Again, it's the same as the Conrad. It has got the slit all the way up. So the idea is that this is a fairly cheap pen. You do generally have to fiddle around with them to get a good flow going. This one probably won't work too well, as I just grabbed this nib and feed out of the box. I don't think I've tuned these ones up yet. I do have others that are tuned, but they're currently not here. So I'll show you a bit of line variation with this one. So you can see the line variation. Now, depending on who you ask, most people consider modern pens to be, even ones like the Ahab, which are marketed as flex, to only be semi-flex. I'll explain why in a minute when I start getting to the vintage and dip pens. Things like the Noodles pens do require a fair bit of force to actually flex, which can cause spring tines and other issues. So they're not the best flex nibs, but for the price, it's an easy way to give it a test and see if you like flexing nibs and flourishing that way. Another one that's actually quite got a bit of a name to it is the Neponset. People either seem to hate or love these pens. The Neponset has what's referred to as the music nib. Let's see if I can get that locked in. There we go. You can see two slits down the actual nib, and the feed has the same. A lot of people have issues with these pens, and causes a lot of problems for people. This one's not too bad. Again, without pressing too hard, you know, that's sort of the flex that you get out of it. Now, if I lower the angle of the pen and press a bit harder, you can get a fair bit more flex out of it. Problem with this is then you can turn your page over and you will see where the lines have actually pressed in. These pens do require a lot of pressure, especially the Nipponset, to flare out and get any sort of good flex on them. Here's a little bit of a downside of these cheaper pens is that exactly that you have to press hard and you can spring them, and you know there's all these sorts of issues, but they're a good way to start out and to give it a crack. This is how I started with them. So you know these pens aren't too bad. They just require a lot more pressure than you know a flex nib really should require. Other modern pens. Let's try this one. So this is one of my more favourites. It's a very similar design to the Noodles with the slit all the way up the middle. That's how they get their flex with this. So there's another slice all the way up the middle. You press down and it opens up. So I'll see if I can do a bit of a writing sample. Yeah, the ink's running out on this one. I only had a small amount in it. So, you know, this sort of pen, these are really considered semi-flex more than real flex. I'll show you what real flex is like on the vintage and dip pens. It does give you a nice bit of line variation, and you wouldn't want to do that all the time, because what can happen is you can actually spring the nib or turn the nib the wrong way up, or turn the actual end of the nib up, which can make it hard to use and railroad and all sorts of other issues that you'll get. But the FBR pens I think are quite nice. Another one I recently got this is their latest one. Same pen design, but it's got a two-tone nib on it, which is quite nice. I'll just do a bit of a dip in some ink. Again, it requires a fair bit of pressure, and you really only get a semi-flex out of it. I have got photos where I've done full flexing, and that's generally with a lot wetter ink. I'll normally lay the pen almost perpendicularly down, and then I'll apply a bit of pressure. You can see right there, that was me scraping the feed on the actual page because I had it too far down. And because there's not actual ink in this pen, it's not going to show too well. I'm only dipping these. That's about what you're going to get out of these in a standard writing session. You're not going to get anything. The Nipponset was about the thickest, but then saying that the Nipponset does have a lot thicker nib as well, which makes a big difference. Another common, what people call a flex pen, but really Pilot don't advertise these as flex pens. It's the Namiki Falcon or the Pilot Falcon. These are actually a soft nib. Now these can be sprung quite easily, and I've seen people do it. And yeah, they're not designed for flexing. They're designed for giving a bit of a softer ride when you write, I guess. I don't recommend buying this if you specifically want to use it for flex. You can get the Spencerian custom grind on it from Motosure or any of the other nib masters. But these pens surely aren't designed for flexing. This is a medium, soft medium, and that's really about all the flex you're going to get out of this one. Any more and I'd be too afraid of springing the nib really. Still, being a medium, it's quite a thick nib. With these ones, generally if you go if you go a finer nib, you'll actually get a bit more line variation. These nibs are springy because of the shape of them, I believe. So these aren't a bad idea, but they're not a flex nib. They're really only a semi-flex and designed primarily just to give you a nicer feel when writing. They're not marketed as flex at all. A common misconception is with modern pens like this Visconti Opera, people think that they've got a flexy nib. No, they have what would be considered more of a springy nib. So they're not designed to flex. They don't do the best flexing job. But as you go across the page, the nib automatically sort of just bounces along, which gives you a much nicer feeling when riding. You can squeeze out line variation. As you can see here. But it's not recommended to do that all the time because you will bend the nib eventually if you press too hard. But it is nice to get that little bit of line variation, like I said, but I wouldn't buy most modern pens like these that have either the palladium nibs or even the gold nibs to buy them specifically for flexing. I'd recommend buying one of these cheaper pens. That way, if you do damage it by pressing too hard, you know, it's like $1 or $2 for a new nib, or you can pay a couple of dollars and get a whole new pen. But yeah, most modern pens are not designed to be flexed. They're just designed to be softer, which gives you a nicer riding experience. Then if you want it, you know, if you press a little bit harder, it will give you a little bit of line variation. You just have to be very careful about springing the nibs on those. Another one I've got some vintage pens here. I'll start off with probably one of the least flexy ones. This is the PSP, I think it's the Soquel. Has a vintage, can't even remember what nib this was. It's a vintage Eversharp nib. 14K nib. Now, nibs don't need to be gold to be flexible, as you can see with the Noodles pens. I also have another vintage pen here. This one here, which has a, okay, I haven't read it, a Pala. I don't think it's a Parker, but this is a steel nib. And this one's actually quite flexible as well, which I'll show you in a minute. So you don't have to have a gold nib to have it flexible, but generally your vintage pens, the way the nibs were designed, you'll generally get a lot more flex without actually having to force it, which is quite nicer when riding. Better for the pen, better for your page. You're less likely to cut through or tear the page as well. So I'll just dip this one in. Alright. So I'd really only call this a semi-flex. That's about all you're going to get out of this pen. This one is a little bit rough. That's probably just me. Yeah, so really this is a semi-flex nib as well. It does require a little bit of pressure, not quite as much as the modern pens. Most of these modern pens require a lot of pressure to flex, which is not always good for it. This one doesn't require quite as much, but you still only get this line variation, which I would still consider semi-flex. I'll show you this steel nib one. Just dip that myself. So again, this one's a steel, but you get a lot more line variation. This I'd consider a full flex. The reason for that is you get a lot more line variation out of it compared to, say, this one up here, which would only be really considered a semi-flex. Semi-flexes are normally for your everyday riding. It's the sort of thing that, you know, you use every day, and you just have it softer so you can actually write nice on the page. It's not really designed for the flexing. This full flex one is slightly better for flex riding. This one here isn't too bad for everyday riding. But you also do have the option of flexing if you require. Quite a nice nib, this one. And this one doesn't require much pressure at all to actually flex, which is quite nice. Less likely to spring the nib or have any issues there. So that's another vintage. So normally your vintages will give you a better nib flexibility. Not always though, like your Parker 51s and a lot of the Schaefers and a lot of even the Parkers, they have quite a stiff nib. So they're not quite designed for flexing at all. Basically, you got to try the nib out and see if it'll flex. But I only recommend putting a light bit of pressure on, as you don't want to damage the nib, because that would be quite sad if that happened. I'll show you another vintage nib. So this one is another flexible gold nib. Actually, no, sorry, this is another steel gold plated nib. Again, this one's only semi-flex. Nowhere near as flexible as the other one. And if you're wondering, because the other nib was bigger, nib size doesn't correlate to how flexy something is, and I'll show you in a minute. Obviously this steel one was a lot flexier than this gold-plated one. It all depends on the type of nib. I'll bring out, this is a full flex vintage Conklin nib. This one gets quite a bit of line variation as well. Like I said, I'm only dipping these pens, so I'll have to go slowly. So this pen I'd consider more of a full flex. You can flex it a bit more, but being only dipped, it's not feeding too well. But yeah, again, this is a 14 carat Conklin number 3 nib. Quite decent for this sort of work. Oh, excuse me. Alright, so next, this is a, you might have heard me mention the, you know, you got your stiff nibs, you got your semi-flex nibs, you've got, say, the Visconti was just a softer nib, so was the Namiki Falcon. They're just soft nibs, they're not even really a flex nib at all. Then you got your full flex nibs, and then you've got ones like this. This pen has a warranted nib on it, 18 karat gold. This is what's referred to as being a wet noodle. So if you've ever heard the term wet noodle, it refers to a pen that is incredibly flexy with no pressure at all. Now, with this pen, the way you can tell a wet noodle is that you actually have to almost take the weight of the pen when writing, lest you come up with other sorts of issues. So I'll show you what I mean. So with the weight of the pen, I just need to put the cap on. It does quite a thick line. Now this pen is almost a stub. I'll do down line and across. So it does have natural line variation as well. But if I take the weight of the pen off the page, you can see these lines here are a lot thinner than these ones. And that's because this nib actually flexes with no pressure at all. If a bit of a pressure is applied, and that's almost no pressure, that's barely the weight of the pen on it, plus a little bit extra. So this is what's referred to as a wet noodle pen. Very nice. This is really what, you know, people desire when they're after a flex pen. It's something that's a bit more wet noodle, but not something I would use every day, purely because you actually have to lift the nib off the page to stop it from flexing too much. Whereas, say, something like a Visconti, which is designed with just a soft nib, you know, that's just purely the weight of the pen there. So you don't have to lift it at all, you just gently drag it across the page. Whereas with the wet noodles, normally you have to lift them off the page. They can be a bit of a pain to write with regularly. So, there you go. A bit of a introduction to some flex pens. So you've got your wet, wet noodles. You've got your, so let me do another dip. Flex pens. and this is vintage. And you've got your flex pens, which is modern, which are really more in line with a semi-flex. Semi-flex, I'd say this is the vintage. Then you have soft modern nibs. Ooh, dip that one too much. Which are really just, they're not flex at all or even semi-flex, they've just got soft nibs, or the Visconti. And they're really your main types in your standard pens. You've got a wet noodle, which doesn't require any pressure at all. Flex pen, especially your vintage, they normally require very little pressure and give you a good bit of line variation. Your modern flex pens, if you compare them to vintage pens, would generally be considered more semi-flex than flexible. So that's the thing there. And then you have your actual semi-flex pens, which can be either vintage or modern. And then you just got soft nibs. Now the other criteria for a flex, or the other flex pens, they're commonly referred to are vintage pens, which are in dip nibs like this. So this is a dip nib here. Can't remember what these ones were called. These were the G nibs, zebra G nib. So I just had to check that. Now these are designed just to dip in and ink like speedball, which is what this one is. And then you can do your flex in that way. So these again are another cheap way to get into flexing, and you know there's people out there that use dip pens all the time, and they do some amazing flex work. And you know this sort of setup's quite cheap. It's a couple of dollars for the nibs, a couple of dollars for a holder, and a couple of dollars for a some dip nib ink. So there you go. Bit of a quick introduction to flex pens. Nothing too fancy, and like I said, I'm no professional, so this is just what I've picked up and what I've got it from experience. Alright, I hope this has helped, and hope you enjoy. Goodbye.